Thank you for those who are joining us in the room and are joining us live stream. We are glad to have our first master session focus on the intersection of homelessness and child welfare, and we welcome our distinguished panel of experts in the field. The panel will be moderated by Sarah Hunter, our federal colleague at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We know that many of you in the audience, as well as our virtual audience, have valuable experience in this area. And I want to encourage you to join us in the lively discussion that's going to be happening in the room and also through the interactive features through the live stream. So thank you, and I will turn it over now to Sarah Hunter.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How are you doing? Good. Woohoo. Great. Good morning to everyone online also. Thanks for joining us virtually for the session this morning. We're gathered for the session on how housing matters for families in the child welfare system. We're going to be talking a bit today about the prominent housing interventions for families that are out in our country today, and talking a little bit about the intersections of that with child welfare. I'm joined here on stage by three great colleagues in the field. And to my left, far left, is Mary Cunningham. She's at the Urban Institute. Mary focuses on programs and policies aiming to end homelessness and also affordable housing issues in the country, and how families can access opportunity better. Welcome, Mary. To my other left here is Beth Shin. She's from Vanderbilt University. Beth researches ways that we can improve our efforts to end homelessness around the country. And then to my right, we have Mike Pergamit from the Urban Institute also. And Mike focuses on integrating and accessing public benefits and services. So thank you all for joining us this morning. We're very excited to be with you. With that, I'm just going to do a little bit of an overview of our session today. So we're going to do kind of a little bit of a non-traditional session. So we're going to do a little bit of time speaking to you about some of the issues around housing and child welfare that are out in the field right now. I'm going to do a little bit of question and answer with our panel, and then we're going to turn it over both to you in the audience here in the room, and then also to the audience online to be able to take some questions for you as you have them. For folks online, if you have questions, you can submit your questions into the chat box right away as soon as you have them, as soon as you think of them, just type them right up. There are folks in the room here who are collecting those questions, and they'll bring them up to me when we get to the Q&A portion of today's session. So, and before we dive into hearing from our panelists, we actually have a video that I want to pull up for you and show you that talks a little bit about one woman's experience with the child welfare system, experience with homelessness, and how that has impacted her family. We're going to spend a few minutes listening to this video, and after the video, we'll talk again.
Before I started the program, I was in a relationship for 6 months. He became very violent towards me, towards my kids. DHS got involved.
No, honey, I'm just trying to say I'm she's just trying to check in.
My children were removed from me for safety reasons. Pretty much they told me that I either left Joe or I'd lose my parental rights to my kids. Not because I was a bad parent, but he was not safe for them, and I wasn't able to keep them safe around him. So I ended up in a homeless shelter. That's when my DHS worker had told me about the program PUSH.
Can you tell me what it is? Something special?
I have never met a parent that didn't love their kid, who didn't want the best for their kids. They just have a lot of complex issues that they don't know how to sort through. They don't know how to navigate. And our system doesn't help because we make our system very complex. If you look at the research on homeless, the majority are young parents with young children. Our families have an open child welfare case. They are homeless or unstably housed, and they have multiple complex needs such as mental health issues, domestic violence, substance abuse. Families are housed within 14 days. They come into a furnished apartment. We don't want families to worry about furnishings, food, any of the basic needs we make sure are taken care of, so they can solely focus on all these multiple needs they have.
I think having a roof over our heads and a place to come home to every night, that took a huge stress off. I was able to actually focus on what DHS had expected of me, where before I put off all of that because my main concern was, where am I going to sleep tonight?
Our state, like many states across the country, are very fragmented in terms of how they deliver services. So we'll deliver mental health services here and domestic violence services here. What our project is trying to do, we have, our staff are called service coordinators, and they're the single point of contact for all the services that the families need. The DHS worked with us so the family sees one aligned plan that they have to do.
They lay it out very clear of what they want from you. Without the family team meeting, I think it would be chaos.
Sometimes either the family doesn't have the skills to listen and understand, or the team members don't have the skills to explain what the family needs to do. So as PUSH, we really just ask those hard questions. Where are we at and where do we need to go? Where does the family want to be? And how do we get there?
The family team meeting really is the key to developing the plan for the family, but also the over time constant review.
So thanks. I think one of the things that I appreciate most about that video is that, while it is just one family's experience, it illustrates so well how both simple the needs are of the family, and at its core, right? We all need a place to live, and yet how complex it is to actually make all of the pieces kind of fall together to actually have an apartment or a house, and also be working toward all of the child welfare goals that a family needs to work toward in order to preserve the family. So thanks for bearing with us with that video. And with that, I think it sets a great foundation. And I'll turn it over to Mary to do a little bit more of that. Sure, yeah.
There we go. Okay, good morning. My name is Mary. I'm a researcher at the Urban Institute. I'm a housing researcher, and since we're here to talk about how housing matters for families who are involved in the child welfare system, we thought it would be really important to start by giving you the lay of the land in terms of what does the housing picture look like in the United States right now, and just give you a sense of what's coming as well. I think most people in this room would not be surprised to hear that we have a severe affordable housing shortage in the United States. Not a surprise there. But when you dig really deeply into the numbers, you can see actually the numbers are showing that it's getting worse, not better, and that over the next decade, it will probably get a lot worse unless something is really significant is done about it. So right now, we have a severe gap in the number of affordable units for low-income families. There are only about 28 units available that are affordable for every 100 extremely low-income household in the United States that needs it. Big gap to fill. What we know is that it's getting worse, not better. There is significant pressure on the housing market because the number of renters is increasing significantly. We've had about 8 million new renters added to the pool of people who are, competing for affordable housing in the market. We know that affordable housing resources are declining, as well as in the private market, a lot of the affordable housing stock is aging and going offline. So unless there's something significant happening in terms of federal resources, it will get a lot worse. And I don't mean to sound like the sky is falling, but it really outlook. And this isn't a problem that only affects sort of big cities or, on the coasts. In every state, there's a significant proportion of renters who are severely cost burdened For non-housing people out there, that means that you're paying more than 50% of your income towards rent each month, which obviously doesn't leave a lot of room for margins of error, for emergencies, health crises, or other unexpected expenses when you are paying so much for rent. And it leaves people pretty vulnerable, both to housing instability, moving frequently, or homelessness. So there are about 11.2 million renters across the United States, households that are severely cost burdened. And urban.org actually has a pretty cool map online where you can go and look at your community and see how many people are cost burdened and what the gap is if you're interested. So why does this matter for child welfare agencies? We've known for a long time that affordable housing is a problem, but when we look at the data, we can see that there's a pretty big overlap in the families who are moving through the homeless system and the families who are moving through the child welfare system. We know from research on the homelessness side that a very big share of homeless families have child welfare involvement, many as young children, but also as adults with their own children. About 20 to 40%, some single site studies in New York and Philadelphia show that about 20% to 40% of families involved in the child welfare system have had some interaction. Families in the homeless system have had some interaction with the child welfare system. And we don't have a full picture. That's usually from matching up shelter data with child welfare data. On the child welfare side, we don't have a full picture here, but we do know that about 11% of children who are placed in foster care, one of the circumstances of their placement is inadequate housing. So we need a lot more data on this. We need a clearer picture of the need of families both in the child welfare system who have housing issues and in the homelessness system, but we know for sure that there's a pretty big overlap. So given that child welfare agencies are not housing agencies, but are still responsible for the safety, permanency, and well-being of children, it's really important to think about housing. And like I said, I know that child welfare agencies are not housing agencies and don't have control of the housing resources in your community. But there are a lot of, albeit scarce, but there are resources in communities that child welfare agencies have been accessing and thinking about, trying to operate smarter, thinking about if housing matters a lot for families, which we're going to hear from Beth and Mike about how much it does, what should we be doing? Because as Sarah said in the beginning, if you really don't have a home or a stable housing, it's very hard to work on your child welfare issues, seek substance use treatment, find a job, become a better parent. And so really having that stability is important. So there's a range of options out there. I know some child welfare agencies have used some of their own resources to provide security deposit, first month's rent to get families into housing quickly. There's a program, Rapid Rehousing, which I'm sure many of you know, maybe some of you don't, but sort of a lighter touch program that homeless service agencies, their local continuums of care operate in your community that helps homeless families get back into housing with maybe a security deposit and short-term rental assistance. There are some child welfare agencies that have partnered with homeless organizations to access those resources for their child welfare families. There's also FUP housing vouchers, which is modeled on the Section 8 program, or Housing Choice Voucher Program, we call it now, for a long time, that provides housing, a deep housing subsidy for families who are actually involved in the child welfare system. And then for families who are really high need, that have mental health issues or physical disabilities or substance use challenges, multiple needs, homelessness and housing problems, supportive housing is a pretty intense intervention that we are now, with ACYF Children's Bureau, testing out with a 5-site demonstration to provide supportive housing for families that are involved in the child welfare system. And that is really linking a deep housing subsidy with really intensive wraparound services to help families maintain their housing stability and also to help get their kids back or prevent removal. And that supportive housing demonstration is going on right now, and Urban is part of the evaluation team. And I know I see some faces right up front. I want people who are involved. It's a 5-site demonstration. If you're one of the sites, can you raise your hand? These are the people in the audience who are doing the work of serving families and implementing the demonstration. You see their hands. If you're interested in supportive housing, you should really talk to them, find them after, and hear about how they're implementing it in their community. The last thing I'll say, and I'm probably out of time, is that one of the things that we're learning and also struggling with, we're struggling with, but we're really trying to understand how Housing First works for child welfare involved families. So as a part of the supportive housing demo, the sites were really encouraged to provide housing first at the beginning of their child welfare case open or interaction, with the idea that housing really can be a foundation and a platform for helping families achieve their case plans, achieve the outcomes that they need to achieve to get their kids back or to keep families together. And that is sometimes in a child welfare context complicated, but a lot of the sites are figuring it out. And so in order to really make housing matter for, did I do that? Oh, I don't think so. For families, providing it really up front first is really important. I will end there and turn it back
Great.
with
All right,
there we go. We got it.
back on.
There we go.
Perfect. And, clearly, with the first couple of slides that Mary talked about, housing stability is an issue for a lot of families across the country. And it's not something that we have the resources to address right away, but we're working on that, and I'll talk a little bit about that more later. The other thing that I would say is, in addition to the list of interventions, housing interventions that Mary laid out, is the plain old vanilla housing choice voucher that doesn't have a service stream attached to it. And Beth will talk a little bit more about that. She's going to talk to us a little bit about a large study that she's undertaken called the Family Options Study. It'll talk a little bit about some of the effectiveness of some of these housing interventions.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. So this is a large study conducted with Apt Associates. They should get some credit too. What we did in 12 communities around the country is a randomized experiment examining 3 housing and service interventions. The first was permanent subsidies, these housing choice vouchers that hold families' expenses to 30% of their income, their expenses for rent and utilities. And the theory behind housing choice vouchers, or permanent subsidies, is that people become homeless because they can't afford housing. Fix the homelessness, and that creates a platform for people to deal with everything else. Second intervention was transitional housing, very different theory. This is congregate housing with intensive psychosocial services, case management, for up to 24 months. And the theory here is that people who become homeless must address problems in order to achieve stability, to lay the foundation for later stability. Third is rapid rehousing. As Mary mentioned, these are temporary rental subsidies with some housing-related services, some job-related services, lasting up to 18 months, typically shorter than that. And the theory is still that it's a housing affordability problem, but the goal is to get people back into conventional housing as fast as possible. And the last intervention was usual care. It was whatever was available in the communities. And so we randomized people to an offer of one of these special interventions or to usual care. Our study families were fairly typical of families who become homeless in the United States. A typical family was a woman around 29 years old with 1 or 2 children. The median income was $7,400. That's income, right? These are desperately poor families. 30% had psychological distress or PTSD symptoms. 63% had a prior episode of homelessness. And although most people who become homeless are homeless just once, we have a big pool of people who have been homeless previously coming back into shelters. And also, we required that folks be in shelters for at least a week before we took them into the study, because if people can resolve homelessness quickly, and many can, then we don't need these heavy-duty interventions. A little over a quarter had a spouse or partner with them in shelter. Another 10% had a spouse or partner who was not in shelter, typically because of shelter rules that still can't accommodate men. And interestingly, 24% had a child who was not with them in shelter. Now, those were almost all informal separations. Less than 1% had a child in foster care. So most of these families were not child welfare involved at the point they came into shelter. There is an overlap between the systems, but it's often homelessness that comes first. Okay? We looked at outcomes in 5 domains: housing stability, adult well-being, family preservation, particularly important for the child welfare context, child well-being, and self-sufficiency. And here's an example of the findings. I won't drag you through this kind of detail everywhere, but here's what permanent subsidies did in comparison to usual care. Large improvements in housing stability. So for self-reported homelessness over the last 6 months, more than halved. Okay? For a shelter stay in the last 7 to 18 months is recorded in management information system records, almost halved. For doubling up in the last 6 months, more than halved. So enormous impacts on housing stability from the housing subsidy intervention. Okay? So half of usual care families had either been in shelter or doubled up recently in the last 6 months, and subsidies reduced homelessness and doubling up by more than half. Rapid rehousing and transitional housing had little effect here. 1 in 7 of our usual care adults reported alcohol or drug dependency, and 1 in 8 reported intimate partner violence recently. And subsidies reduced some of these things that can lead to both homelessness and child welfare involvement. So housing subsidies without any additional services reduced dependence on alcohol and drugs by about 1/3, and intimate partner violence by more than half. Subsidies also reduce psychological distress. So getting people stabilized really helped all of these other aspects of their functioning. 15% of our usual care families had a child who was with them in shelter at the outset, right? We already had kids separated at the outset. But 15% of those who had a child with them in shelter at the outset was separated from, had that child separated from their family at some point in the last 6 months. Many of those separations were ongoing. 4% had a child placed in foster care in that 6-month period. So we're beginning to see the foster care creep up in these families. Subsidies reduced those informal separations by about 40%, by about 2/5. They reduced the foster care placements by 3/5. So the housing subsidies are having an impact on the child welfare outcomes. Subsidies reduce moves among schools, school instability, and both subsidies and rapid rehousing reduce school absences by about the same amount. Self-sufficiency, fewer than 1/3 of the usual care families worked for pay in the week before the survey. So we have a lot of disability that hampers work, but we also have a lot of people, this is coming out of the recession, but we're not fully out of the recession at follow-up, which was 20 months after families were enrolled. Subsidies reduced work effort by about 1/5, so that's the one adverse effect of the subsidy intervention. Both subsidies and rapid rehousing increased food security. So even though families were working a little bit less, their food security was a good deal better. And rapid rehousing also increased household income a little bit, but still way below the level that families could afford housing on the private market. So what are the lessons here? Overall, the subsidies not only reduced homelessness, but they had these radiating impacts on every other domain that we studied. And the subsidies alone, without additional services, reduce some of the problems that can lead to homelessness and child welfare involvement. They reduce child separations, they improve school outcomes, they reduce some of the adult problems that can lead to child welfare involvement. There's a lot of support here for the theory that housing subsidies, that housing or homelessness among families really is a housing affordability problem that subsidies can resolve, and that can decrease the burden on the child welfare system and the burden of child welfare, okay? Transitional housing and rapid rehousing had little effect on these outcomes. Rapid rehousing was less costly, so it's certainly better than what we're doing usual care because you get the same kinds of outcomes at lower cost. But strong support for this theory that resolving homelessness resolves other issues and that homelessness really is about housing affordability.
Great, so I'm going to pass it over to Mike, but I think, you know, thinking about kind of the issues that homeless families face, thinking about what it is that they need to get back on their feet, and learning from the Family Options Study that clearly a housing subsidy is kind of a game changer, not only in their housing stability, but in a whole host of other outcomes, right? And thinking about what the implications are for the families that you serve. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to turn to Mike, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the specific voucher program that Mary highlighted a few minutes ago too, the Family Unification Program. Talk about some of the impacts of that program, that voucher program, on some child welfare outcomes.
Thank you, Sarah. So the Family Unification Program, or the unfortunate acronym FUP, is a HUD-based program that awards vouchers to public housing authorities that are these same housing choice vouchers that Beth was talking about, the permanent subsidy, but they're set aside for families in the child welfare system. And there are two types of eligible families that are spelled out. Families for whom the lack of adequate housing is a primary factor in the imminent placement of the family's child or children in out-of-home care, and we refer to those as preservation families. You're trying to keep from having to remove children into foster care. And then secondly, it can be for families where, due to inadequate housing, there's a delay in discharging the child from foster care back into the home. There's something wrong with that slide, but we refer to those as reunification families. And the, should I do that? The Housing Authority receives the vouchers from HUD, and they're required to partner with their local child welfare agency, and they receive the funding for subsidizing the voucher, but there's no additional service money. So this is really just like a housing choice voucher that Beth described, but as I said, set aside specifically for child welfare families. So we conducted an evaluation of the FUP program. We actually looked at 8 different FUP programs around the country to see how they're implemented. And a couple of years ago, we came out with a brief that I won't talk about here, but if you go to the urban.org website, we describe the 8 different programs, and we talk about some of the promising practices we saw there. But I'm going to talk today more about what kind of outcomes we see from it, and for that, we looked at 2 particular cities. All right. Portland, Oregon, and San Diego, California. And the San Diego program is what I would say is a typical FUP program. And so if you looked at FUP programs across the country, most of them are going to look like this. That is, there's the Child Welfare Agency goes through some kind of referral process. Usually they give these definitions out to their caseworkers who refer families on their caseload who they think meet one of these conditions. That referral goes over to the Public Housing Authority. Public Housing Authority fits this in some way with their regular housing choice voucher program and does sort of their usual screening. Are you eligible for a voucher? And you do an income check and a criminal background check and things like that. And then if you pass, they'll issue you a voucher, and then it's as always, you take the voucher and you search for a place to, the landlord will take the voucher and try to get leased up. And there's some basic support for that all families, anyone who applies gets a housing choice voucher can get, but there's very, very limited support in terms of filling out the application, searching for housing, or the support you need to actually get leased up. And then there's, on the post-lease up side, there's a requirement for the Child Welfare Agency to keep serving the families, but that's limited both, first off, there are no new resources for that. And so it's basically Child Welfare Agencies fit that in with their current practices. So whatever their current situation is, if a court orders that case closed or something, they fit it in with their usual case, say post-reunification case management or whatever's appropriate. That's what San Diego looks like, and that's not a bad thing. That's just, as I said, that's very typical, whereas there are some places out there that are going above and beyond, and Portland, Oregon is sort of one of them. And so what they did that looks different is, first, the Child Welfare Agency really developed a system to do a much deeper look into what families they were referring, and sort of a more deep referral process and a review process of those families to think, are we really referring over the families that we think are the best to use a FUP voucher? Secondly, over on the housing authority side, housing authorities have certain discretion over the HUD rules as to what they allow. Now, in the regular housing choice voucher program, you come in and you fail a criminal background check, they just move on pretty much to the next applicant on their wait list, because as many of you know, wait lists for Section 8 type vouchers in many cities are quite long. But these being set aside specifically for child welfare families, the housing authorities have to take from that particular referral list. So what we see in Portland, and there are some other places that do this, is much more of an effort to what we call screen in, so instead of screen out, right? Instead of rejecting a family for not meeting certain conditions, they don't break any rules, they just try to use the discretion they have, as well as work with the family and the Child Welfare Agency to do better at being able to pass those housing screens and get a voucher. And that's, we really see in Portland, for instance, that almost every single family that got referred actually got their voucher. Part of that's also due to some of the upfront work the Child Welfare Agency does to be prepared to mitigate some of those circumstances that can prevent a family from getting a voucher, because they have a real working relationship between the two organizations. And then a real important facet of Portland, and where we really see FUP maybe doing better in other places, such as, say, Connecticut, I know I saw them here, is, in this case, the county came in, it's Multnomah County, Oregon, and funded 3 CBOs to provide various types of assistance, starting with the application. One thing we see when we look at San Diego, where there's no assistance, a lot of people never make it through the application because it's a tedious process, it requires gathering documents, there's a lot to it. So in Portland, everybody gets their application done because somebody helped them get through that process. And then they also help them with searching for housing, which is a tough thing to do when you don't have transportation and you don't know how to go about it. Leasing up, where you have landlords who maybe you pass the housing authority screen, but that doesn't mean the landlord's keen on renting to you, so they help out with getting that lease up through. And then they're also there to provide post-lease up support. And some of these families have now been working with these CBOs for several years to help them with the various sorts of issues they have to deal with. So what did we find? Well, the questions we set out to evaluate were basically, if we're giving these vouchers to families where they're at imminent risk of removal, did it prevent the removal? Secondly, for those where there's a delay in discharge, did it actually get help reunify the child or children with the family? Were they able to close the cases sooner, which is advantageous for both the Child Welfare Agency and the family generally? And finally, did it reduce reentry to the system, or actually specifically we're going to look at whether it reduced re-reports of maltreatment. So we separate the preservation and reunification because there's a real difference in the phenomenon of how these vouchers interact with the families, but kind of going through the findings, that description of the sites is really important for understanding why we see some of the things we do or don't see between San Diego and Portland, but there's some other things about them too. So in terms of preserving and preventing removal, we do not find any real differences. And the main reason, and this is true of both these sites, is we compared families who got FUP vouchers to families that were referred as and deemed eligible for FUP, but because there were no more FUP vouchers, were on a wait list. And so when we compare those two groups, what we find that wait list group tells us what would happen in the absence of FUP vouchers, and very small percentages of children get removed from these families. The families that are being selected in both these cities have this imminent risk of removal is clearly not that imminent because very low rates of removal. So it's hard to have an impact on something that's barely happening in the first place. And that's an important lesson to think about, are these the families we want? And maybe they are, because see in some of the other situations, preventing removal isn't the only objective. Can you close cases faster? In Portland, absolutely, they close their cases faster. In San Diego, again, it's actually not, but for similar reasons. That is, most of the cases in the waitlist group were getting closed. This is all 18 months past the time of getting referred, and most of the waitlist cases in San Diego were also getting closed. So this could be differences in child welfare practices, and if it is, I think you have to think about how use of FUP vouchers intersects with child welfare practices. Could also be which families were getting referred, and maybe they were referring families in San Diego that were closer to getting their case closed. That's hard for us to say. But in both cases, even though the likelihood of closing a case was only higher in Portland, the speed at which cases got closed was faster in both sites. So actually, it did lead to faster case closing. And finally, re-reports, looking again 18 years later, and in both cities we see a reduction, that is fewer re-reports among the families that got FUP vouchers than the ones who did not. So that's a very positive sign, and that's the sense in which I all right, anyway, that's the sense in which that's the sense in which I was saying it may be not just were we trying to prevent removal, but also if it reduces future maltreatment of children, then it's got a really important impact, even if it didn't actually prevent removal at that point. Moving on to reunification families, somewhat of a similar story, not quite as strong in San Diego. So the San Diego, I'm just going to say, right, basically, same basic story is that San Diego was picking families where most of these children in the waitlist group were getting reunified. So they really, apparently, this housing wasn't the necessary thing in order to get the child reunified. And that's true with the case closing argument, whereas in Portland, we really see that in the waitlist group, there was a much lower rate. They really were picking families that were much less likely to get reunified in the absence of FUP. So by getting the FUP voucher, it did actually help reunify children, and it helped reunify them faster. It got their cases closed, more likely to get closed. And then finally, now here's the one tricky thing, re-reports. Now in San Diego, it did actually reduce re-reports, so very consistent with what we saw for preservation families. In Portland, we got this very disturbing and strange finding that it looked like it increased re-reports. But in digging into this, what we realized is since in Portland, they're much more likely to reunify children in the FUP group, you're not going to get a re-report if you don't have your child. So this is really more a statistical artifact, that because they are more likely to have their children now, and in fact, the people in Portland were very nice and went back through all the case files for us in all these situations and found that almost all of these reports occurred during trial home visits. And of course, if the ones who never reunified never had a trial home visit. So we don't know. I can't say that it reduced reports, that's for sure, but I think the fact that it looks like it increased it is really not a real finding in the sense of that it wasn't that FUP caused an increase in maltreatment. So that, I think, summarizes our findings, and yes.
Thanks, Mike. And I just have one slide that I'm going to show you, and this is the slide that says, you know, you've kind of taken all this information in that we've presented for you, and you're saying, well, you know, Mary's telling me that we're in a whole heck of a lot of trouble here because we don't have enough housing. Beth is telling us a little bit about what works for homeless families. Mike is telling us a little bit about the effectiveness of the FUP vouchers. So what I'm going to do is kind of put that all together and say, hey, HUD is listening to what the researchers are saying. And in fact, the president's budget in this past year put out a request for $11 billion over 10 years in mandatory spending to get housing interventions into the hands of the families who need them. And that is specifically targeted to families experiencing homelessness, but we know that those families overlap with families that we see in child welfare, as we've talked about earlier. This budget request is rather historic. It's been a long time since HUD has requested vouchers and homeless assistance funds for families in this kind of way at this level. And so I'm really just putting it out there because I want y'all to know that there is this request that has been made of the Congress from the president that says, you know, we think we know what we can do here to make impacts. We're asking for the money to do it. And if you give us the money to do it, we think we can turn this around and really improve the lives of a very significant number of families out there. So just for you all to know that that as the administration, we are seeing the results of these studies and saying, let's get money into the hands of families to actually improve some of these outcomes. So, you know, you guys will all go back home and think about what you could do with information like this. And those online too, thinking about what you can do with information like this, to know that there is such a request out there, even though it's probably not in directly the field in which you work. It is something that will tremendously benefit families that you see who are having issues obtaining stable housing. So this proposal exists, and we can link you up to more information about that outside the session too. So.
Sarah works for HUD, so she can't tell you to lobby. I can.
I cannot tell you to lobby. But there's a lot of great information in here. So I'm just gonna transition us quickly to a question. This is kind of really like the so what question. So like, you all are sitting out here in the audience. We're talking about housing. It's probably not the primary thing that you're focusing on in your day-to-day work, but you know that it impacts the lives of the families you serve. So this is the so what. So why should you all who are working in child welfare care about the housing situations of families who are involved in the system? And we've talked about this some already, but I don't know if anybody wants to add to the answer to these questions. Beth or Mary, maybe?
I would love to.
Yeah, great, okay.
They've been talking a lot.
It's been a while since we've heard from you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think what the evidence, which I think is still emerging, right? So we have some evidence on the homeless side that shows that housing matters and for stability, but also that vouchers actually buy a lot more than the housing, right? That it can help keep families together and reduce other negative outcomes or increase positive outcomes. And then on the flip side, I think what this evidence shows, which is really promising, I don't think, you know, I think we need a lot more evidence, but it shows that housing actually can be an intervention that can get child welfare outcomes, which I don't think child welfare agencies often think about. When I talk to caseworkers or child welfare directors, I think we all know that housing is important, but often it's thought of as another resource to get families. So food stamps, WIC, access to housing, and that will help families, get stabilized in housing. But I think what the evidence is showing is that it actually could help child welfare agencies obtain your outcomes that you're after. So it could actually, help you move a step further in helping families stay together, preserving families, helping families reunify, making sure that families don't come back into the system. I think that's what some of the evidence is showing. And so I'm a researcher. I do a lot of qualitative work, talking to families, doing in-depth interviews, and as a part of the supportive housing demonstration, I talked to one family, and I just want to, because I think her story really illustrates kind of how housing matters for families. She was a young mom. Her name's Sabrina, not her real name. But I sat in her living room not too long ago and really talked to her about her situation. So she had 2 kids, 2 years old, 3 years old, and she had just gotten them back after many months, 17, 18 months in foster care. And she was a really young mom, somewhere around 20. And she told me that at the time her kids were moved out of the home, that she was having a lot of trouble. She didn't really know how to parent. She was homeless, in and out of housing situations, sleeping in other people's houses, doubled up, no stable housing situation to speak of for a very long time. She had actually been in foster care herself, so she didn't have a strong parenting figure either. And she desperately wanted to maintain her family and wanted to keep her family together. When she came into the child welfare system, as a part of this demonstration, she was referred to supportive housing. So she got access to an apartment, got help paying for her rent, and she also got some evidence-based interventions around parenting services that helped her think about how to approach parenting in a better way. And she, at the time I talked to her, was doing much better. She had a job in construction. She had her kids back. And she was really thinking about things that I, as a mom, think about. She was thinking about where her kids were going to go to school. She was living in a better school district as a result of the housing intervention. She was telling me that her kids had really high vocabularies and that she reads them every night. And she really cared about these things that we all care about, and we all need time and space to care about. But when you're really poor and struggling, you don't have that time. And she said that the housing subsidy and the support that she was getting from her caseworker really helped her have stability. So she was still struggling, though. She was still poor, but she wasn't falling apart. And that stability was enough to help her kids. And so I think, when you think about sort of 2-generation, maybe the mom, she was talking about her career once her kids got in school and was ambitious. She's going to continue to struggle. I left that house thinking, I'm not going to be depressed by this, because I could still see that she was exhausted, that she came home every night and had to make a real big effort to try to find time to play with her kids, that her living room was, there was not a lot of furniture, but she had 2 kids, pictures of her kids, recent pictures hanging on the living room wall. So she was still struggling, but that support of the housing and the services really gave her the stability to be able to keep her family together and to be able to provide that stability and continuity for her kids.
So let me give you another reason, and we just happen to have a slide here. These are data from one of the sites of the Family Options Study from Alameda County, which is across San Francisco Bay from San Francisco to the east. And what you have here is child welfare reports before and after families entered shelter. So this is a group of 198 families. The arrow at the bottom, that big black arrow, shows the point at which they entered shelter. And then we've got kind of 90 days in each of those bars on each side of entering shelter. So you see that before families entered shelter, we had some child welfare reports, but they really spiked at the point that the families entered shelter. So in the 3 months after families came into shelter, 24 of those 198 families, 1 in 8, were reported to child welfare. That very light colored bar at the top, those were evaluated out. They weren't even investigated. The little darker pink bar below that, those are the ones that were investigated and found unsubstantiated. The bright red, 2 families were inconclusive. 1 family out of those 24 was substantiated. And although 24 families had reports, that were many more reports than 24. That's the worst outcome any family had during that 90-day period. So families coming into shelter makes them visible, puts them at risk of child welfare reports. A lot of those reports are not founded. The child welfare people evaluated them out. And it's especially black families that were reported. They weren't more likely to be substantiated over the next years, but they were more likely to be reported. And so that's another reason that child welfare folks should really care about housing, because families who become homeless are really at risk of involvement in your system, and they're at risk of involvement not only for the child abuse and neglect that you're really concerned about, but also for all of these extraneous reports that really don't seem to indicate real abuse and neglect, but just somebody is worried about kids because they're homeless.
So in the interest of time, we'll keep plugging along here and go to the second question, which is, really like, okay, so I have all this information. I'm not a housing person. What do you expect me to do to help impact stability for the families I see and for the families that we come in touch with in child welfare? I don't know who wants to start with this one.
Sure, I can start. I think the real important step that child welfare agencies can take is really understanding how many families have housing needs. So there's a little bit of information collected across the country, but not enough by child welfare agencies. I know 2 of the sites in our demo actually are implementing tools. So this is the supportive housing demo. In Connecticut, they are testing or really have rolled out a tool that assesses families' housing needs at the investigation stage. And so really understanding how many families involved in the child welfare system actually need housing is really important, and also can help you as a child welfare agency think about how to line up resources in your community and access those resources. So if you know that 10% of your families have severe housing needs, you can go and partner with the PHA or the homeless provider and say, these are the same families that we're serving. Help me, let's leverage our resources and put them together. And that's the second thing I would say, which is look out into your community. I know child welfare agencies are not housing agencies and shouldn't become housing agencies, but you should be looking out into your community and figuring out who has the housing resources, even though they are scarce. PHAs, city housing agencies, local continuums of care, homeless service providers, and developing partnerships with those agencies so that if you are serving all of the same families, a lot of them, that you're actually putting your resources together to really give the family a more holistic service intervention.
Mm-hmm. Just for folks who aren't in the housing world to say what some of that jargon is, if I may. PHA is a public housing authority. They're the folks who can issue Section 8 vouchers. They also have public housing. They have some other resources as well. And the continuum of care is something that is mandated in each community to coordinate homelessness services. And so your community will have a continuum of care where all the people who get engaged with homelessness come together and make a coordinated application for funds to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So the public housing authorities, the continuum of care, and the particular agencies that are part of that continuum in your community are your potential resources. You're not housers, but you can cooperate with the people who are.
You want to touch this one, Mike?
Well, I think one thing Mary did not mention was, as part of supportive housing, one of the principles is housing first. This idea that normally the way housing typically works is they think about housing ready. So you have a case plan, and when you go through your substance abuse treatment, whatever, when you're ready, we'll give you housing. And the housing first principle, which has been shown to be very effective, is no, first we give them housing, and that stabilizes people so that they can take advantage of those services. And people are actually more likely to engage in services when they're given the housing first. And I think that's really just an important principle that child welfare agencies need to address, and as part of this partnering is where that can really come into play. How do you give housing first if you don't even have the housing? So obviously you need the partnering that both Mary and Beth talked about. And then I think, though, even if agencies start getting that message, getting caseworkers to understand that. We've done focus groups with caseworkers, and you'll hear that they'll not only say, we're not housers, but why do we give them housing and then we still take care of their kids for them? It's like it's going to be a major cultural change, but we've seen it happening in the supportive housing demonstration that Mary's mentioned, that getting caseworkers to understand this principle and how it can actually help their families. So I think that's another thing that agencies need to do, is work on that internal culture with their caseworkers.
I mean, the one thing that I would add too, from the kind of the HUD standpoint, is that, we're kind of sitting up here in front of a child welfare audience and talking about the things that child welfare can do, right? But we're also reflecting this back at HUD. So one of the strategic plan core principles at HUD is to use housing as a platform to improve quality of life. And that means for us that we're translating to our PHAs, to our continuums of care that we fund, that we ought to be paying attention to all the other outcomes that families are working to achieve as well. And that we're also asking our continuums of care and our public housing agencies to get better at collaborating with you, and to get better at working with folks who have that deep knowledge of what the interventions are that help really unify families and help bring our young people to a better place in this country too. So we are as doggedly asking our folks on the housing side to kind of answer these questions and ask these questions in communities, and where possible to come to you and ask for your insight and help as well in how we address not only issues from the way we see it, right, as issues of homelessness and housing instability, but to help you address the outcomes that you're working to achieve with the families you see too. So with that, I think we're going to open it up for questions. We have, I think, about a half an hour left, so a good chunk of time. And I know that I see from Dory that there are a handful of questions that have come in from online already. So if there are folks in the room who want to use a mic, feel free to walk up to the mic and ask a question. And Dory, if you want to pass questions or ask them yourself, I don't know how you want to do it, but.
Can I just say, can you come to the first mic, because there's this big bright light, and then we'll be able to see you.
Great, tell us who you are and where you're from too.
My name is Megan, and I work for DC's Child and Family Services Agency. And my question is for Mike. I'm curious about the re-reports. It sounds like you guys haven't done a whole lot of research on that yet in Portland. I'm wondering if those have resulted in re-entries, and if those were substantiated re-reports, and what you've done as far as research on how long those cases were open, what kind of research you've actually done into that, and what kind of research you plan to do on those re-reports. Was there any sort of like length of stay that those kids were in care, any kind of, other supports that were provided to those families? Have you looked at any of those kind of things?
So I can only answer a part of that. Basically, we did not have a chance to look into whether the reports led to reentry into the system, but those were substantiated reports, so I assume that mostly they did. And in Portland, they were, as I said, if they were getting FUP, they were getting extra support, and that might have prevented reopening a case because knowing that they were getting this extra help, and we haven't looked into that either. Right now, we don't have any current plans for research, but we are open to suggestions and funding.
All right, thank you.
Good morning. As you
morning.
know, I'm Ann Farrell at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, and I'm one of the evaluators of one of the demonstration projects in Connecticut. This is a really good panel. Thank you. Very efficiently, but still nuanced presentation of these really compelling issues. I'd like to highlight something that I think is probably an extension of the last question and something that we've all been talking about inside the demonstrations. I think this morning you're preaching to the proverbial choir. And at the same time, as we talk about the costs of these interventions and the potential benefits of these interventions, what could get lost in the larger discourse about housing and families in the child welfare system is, in fact, the cost. I think the benefits, there are human benefits here that we're very well aware of in terms of promoting wellness and well-being. And at the same time, the findings of here and elsewhere about re-reports and re-substantiations seem to be at best mixed. And we've had some conversations about whether that may be due, in fact, to the enhanced surveillance that these families experience inside these programs, so that there are a lot of eyes on these families. And at the same time, I think we're not 100% sure of that, right? So could you all think about that a little bit and talk with us about your thinking on it? And really, how do we message the findings in a field that's so complex, that involves so many systems, and at a time when resources are so slim that we really have to speak responsibly about this, and at the same time, I think, make this compelling case to continue investing in this, because we have so many unanswered questions and families really do need these supports.
So let me speak for the Family Options Study, which was not a child welfare study, it was a homelessness study. And what we found surprisingly over the first 20 months of the study is that offering families housing vouchers was no more expensive than usual care. The families who got housing vouchers used them at very high rates, or were offered them used them. And the families in usual care used a lot more emergency shelter and transitional housing, which are very expensive interventions. So over the first 20 months, it was really a wash. Rapid rehousing was about 10% cheaper. Transitional housing with heavy-duty services was a little bit more, but the difference was not large. We don't expect that it to continue to be a wash, because the housing subsidies are permanent, and we'll be in October releasing 37-month report. But at least in the short term, the housing subsidies did not cost more, so all of these benefits were really at no additional cost, just looking at the housing and service system.
So I would just add to that, I think we need a lot more evidence on the costs of both these interventions. So you know, Ann, that we are looking at, as a part of the evaluation team, looking at the costs of supportive housing and really trying to understand if the benefits outweigh the costs. And our hypothesis is that if you can help reunify families faster, and you can close cases, and you can prevent re-reports, that you could actually have some potential cost offsets or cost savings from the intervention. And that supportive housing, which actually is a pretty intensive intervention, services, plus deep subsidy, housing voucher, or something similar, So I think that there is possibly some cost offsets there. We don't know yet. We'll hopefully know sometime soon, over the next couple of years, in researcher a lens, that's soon. But I will say that vouchers, housing choice vouchers, FUP vouchers, cost $10,000 on average to administer a year. That is not that much money compared to how much child welfare agencies spend. If we could have more vouchers to stabilize families, I think there are really big cost offsets that you could have. And we just need to have more evidence around that. I'll add one more thing to your kind of mixed, the re-reports. And I think the evidence is still emerging. It is not overwhelmingly conclusive. And I think Mike will be proud of me when I say science is a process. And it's really peeling back the onion. You have to keep on looking at the question. And we need more research on this issue. We need more demonstrations, more innovation, and we need strong evaluation with it. And that's how you make the case. I mean, I am not always confident that our political system works on an evidence base. In fact, I think that it works directly opposite. But I will say that it's really reassuring. Sarah showed earlier that the president requested $11 billion for housing vouchers and rapid rehousing. And that is an evidence-based budget proposal. And it really is related to the evidence that has come out of family options. And so I think that's really reassuring. And so I just think, I know it sounds like a classic researcher, but we need more evidence and we need more studies.
I mean, one of the things that I take away from just listening to each of you talk about this, I think, is, the way we think about it in the homelessness field. That's kind of where I come from. Is you think about how you get the most expensive intervention to the one who needs the most expensive intervention, right? And there are interventions that are less costly that maybe some of the families that experience homelessness can use and benefit from and be just as successful, right? And I think we learned a little bit about that out of the family option study. But I think what that kind of cross there between how could we actually tell that story for families in child welfare? Does every family in child welfare need the deep, deep intervention that with a very large service package and the kind of supportive housing model? Or is there a way to do light touch? I'm not the one to answer this question. I'm just putting it out there as perhaps the next kind of phase of the research, right? Which is, could a lighter touch set of services with something like a voucher actually benefit a good deal or a good number of families out there in the system? That's not what the supportive housing demo is meant to test. It's actually meant to test the opposite, right, I think. But perhaps that is kind of the next phase of where we go in learning about how housing plays an impact for families involved in child welfare.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that, Sarah, that it's absolutely right. There's clearly would be a heterogeneity, various differences across different families that need different things. And so going back to one of Mary's first points, which is this idea of child welfare agencies collecting information about the housing needs of their families and in enough depth that they can figure out what the array of housing needs are so you can start figuring out who to assign to these different possible housing options.
And San Francisco has done a lot of work on that in the demo, has actually added some categories to not just asking, do you have inadequate housing, but really fleshing out those categories of the range of housing needs and being able to use that information to actually target families for supportive housing. In San Francisco, can you guys raise your hands so if people want to come and talk to you about that, they can?
Hi, I'm Amy Hance. I'm a program specialist with the Children's Bureau in the Region 7 office in Kansas City, and Iowa is actually my state. So, and I'll be in Cedar Rapids later this month. So I don't know a lot about the PUSH program, but I'm excited I know about it. I'm excited to learn more, especially from watching the video. So I have some really basic questions. I did child welfare work in my past life. I was familiar with the FUP program, but more often than not, didn't have a lot of success. You know, they never seemed to have vouchers. It was always full or a waiting list. Do you guys know how many FUP vouchers are actually available? Like if I were to say to you in Iowa, do you know how many FUP vouchers, I feel weird saying it, housing choice vouchers are available for the state of Iowa? Or I don't really know exactly how it works. I think I know there might be vouchers in Des Moines and maybe not anywhere else, or vouchers in, it's more a local-based kind of thing, but I don't even know how many are available. They don't talk about it in their our annual report that we get from them, and I've pushed them, so I'm pushing in terms of both the youth and the families. So that's one of my questions is how many are available? Also, do we know how many we aren't reaching? So we have this many vouchers, we have this many families who really could use it, but we can't get it to them because they're not available. Do we have that data? And then my last piece is probably more of a comment about the re-reports. I know we all would hope there could be a silver bullet in child welfare, but we know there isn't. And so I think in thinking about re-reports and outcomes like that, you can't just think about did solving the housing issue, what did it lead to in terms of outcomes? I mean, everybody in here knows this, but there's so many other variables to consider. Was that family substance abuse involved at the time? Was there domestic violence issues, mental health issues? So it's kind of hard to say this led to this without considering all those other things. Plus, you don't know that, I mean, you touched on this with your two different approaches between Oregon and San Diego? San Diego. The differences in practices, how the families were treated. So just wanted to say that.
Lots of questions in there.
Indeed. So let me take some of the kind of voucher questions first, and then we'll pass it along. So, I don't know the number of FUP vouchers. Maybe somebody else.
20,000.
Around 20,000 FUP vouchers across the country that exist, and we haven't had a new batch of FUP vouchers in I think 4 or 5 years now. The Congress is very interested in FUP, and in recent years has been more focused on FUP for youth. So last year, and actually in the FY17 budget, there is a set aside for $20 million actually for new FUP for youth specifically. And then in a recent housing bill that passed, we got some new authority for youth-specific FUP. But without new vouchers, right, like it is very much a zero-sum game there, balance between family vouchers and youth vouchers. So any of the improvements we're making on the youth side to using those vouchers for youth, we know are making an impact on the vouchers that are going to families. So, and we can talk more about the youth vouchers offline, and I'd be happy to do that with you. From the kind of the big picture, the housing choice vouchers, I mean, it's really the same kind of principle is true, right? There haven't been a significant number of new vouchers appropriated from the Congress in a long time. And in fact, the sequestration hit the voucher program pretty hard. And that has resulted in a lot of communities as in very much a tightening of the belt of who's getting access to those vouchers, and a lengthening of wait lists in many communities. This is a very scarce resource that we know, we have studies that say, you know, we need more, families need help with affordable housing, and the housing choice voucher actually does have a positive impact on families. So, you know, we are making the best case possible to get more, but in communities, they're very strapped in figuring out how to actually you know, get the vouchers that they have out to folks who need them. So that's why you see that kind of tension play out. And the tension exists between child welfare and public housing and all the other kind of community-based organizations that are working with really strapped, poverty-stricken families who, you know, who we really want to get a housing subsidy in their hands, and we just frankly don't have enough, right? So, and that the problem, like Mary was saying earlier, is getting worse and worse without any end in sight, except for proposals to put new vouchers on the table.
So I would just add to that to say, because you were talking about, asking about vouchers in your community, in your state, and so the best way to find out is to go to your public housing authority, go to your housing agency, and shimmy up to them and ask them if they have any FUP vouchers, and get to know them and try to convince them that a partnership is beneficial, because PHAs need help too. Public housing agencies need help, and so as much as, you know, connecting them with families, providing some services and support, creating partnerships, you know, the squeakiest wheel gets the oil, and so trying to figure out who in the community has those resources, even though they are scarce, and coming together and really looking at, if you're serving the same families, how can you do it better together?
Other aspects of that question?
One last question, I think. It was like about re-reports and disentangling. Okay.
Comment.
Yeah.
So thanks to the panel. This was a great discussion. And so we have a ton of questions from online, from the virtual audience. So I have to kind of pick one, but here's one specifically about the unique needs of young parents. And the question is, any suggestions about how we can get our community to address and create specific services for them? Any suggestions for effective services for young parents who are facing housing instability?
So I would say, I mean, I know Beth would say, first of all, that young parents, let me chill you for a minute. But I mean, I've heard you say in other panels, young parents are at high risk for homelessness, especially ones with infants, right? And so, one of the things that in the supportive housing demo, there are many evidence-based interventions that the sites are implementing that look at parenting in particular, parents as teachers, and just provide parent coaching. And actually that one young woman that I talked to, you know, I kind of went into her living room, Sabrina's living room, thinking, okay, she's doing better because of the housing and that stability, and I think that's true. But I also heard a lot about how the services around parenting were helping her think about a routine for her kids and consistency and, you know, reading to her children and thinking about how to respond to temper tantrums. And so all of those kind of evidence-based interventions around parenting, I think, can be really helpful, especially for families like Sabrina that are young moms who didn't grow up with strong parenting figures and don't know really where to start. And we have a list on the Urban website. There's a description of the supportive housing demo of the 5 sites, which, by the way, are Cedar Rapids, San Francisco, Memphis, and Connecticut, and Broward County. And we have a description of the intervention, also as well as the services. And then also, everyone is in the room here, so you can find them.
Anyone else?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Grace, and I currently work for COA, which is an accrediting body, but I have a lot of history working with youth, and I still do it on the side. And so I noticed that we have a lot of youth that are cyclically going through poverty and going through the child welfare system, and now they're becoming parents themselves. And so in New York City, we have this, you know, public shelter system, and then they filter out their young people to these nonprofit shelter systems that they're not being, I don't think, fully counted within this like public sector of being young people that are poor, that have children, that are going through the child welfare system, often have open cases, but they're sitting in these transitional living programs, and our response is rapid rehousing. Let's get them a housing voucher, let's get them into an apartment. And so I'm curious to know, like, should we focus more, or not necessarily focus more, but put some thought into like transitional living, independent living, where we're actually teaching them a skill on how to be independent. And we have often these situations where these people are coming back into contact with, child welfare or various systems because they're not getting a skill set before we give them that right to housing, and housing is a right. But does it necessarily have to be a voucher that puts them in their own place where they don't necessarily have the supports?
So I'm happy to take a little bit of this one. This is kind of right up my alley a bit. So, and kind of highlight a recent opportunity that just came out of HUD. So, so I think one of the things that we've been talking about over and over at HUD and with our partners at HHS is how to think about homelessness for young people who are really making that transition to independence in a very specific way, and what are the housing options that those young people face, either with or without kids, whether they're pregnant and parenting or whether they're what we call unaccompanied in the homelessness world, without their parents. So, so one of the two things that I would highlight that we've been kind of thinking about in this realm. One is that we're trying to build up an array of options for young people so that it's not simply a question between transitional housing or rapid rehousing, but instead that we're thinking about or a voucher, that it's not just this kind of this or this question, but is there an array of options? Is there a family intervention that would be appropriate? Could we somehow help support the family with some financial assistance to actually help link a young person back to either the family of origin or some other kind of person in their lives who would be that permanent connection? Or is a transitional living arrangement more appropriate, or is a voucher more appropriate? And in any of those circumstances, how do we ensure that a young person is getting access to the kind of the living skills that they might need to help understand what that transition looks like? It goes back to, I think, what Mary was pointing out earlier with kind of the young parenting question. Just last week, HUD released a funding opportunity for communities to compete for $33 million in 10 sites, 4 of which have to be rural, to basically build their network of both folks who are collaborating around this work for youth. So we know that youth are impacted by a lot of different systems, from schools to child welfare to juvenile justice, that there are a lot of folks looking out for young people. How do we make sure that we bring that community together and then offer some specific resources to build up a set of housing interventions across that community in some new ways? What this opportunity provides actually is for communities to dig in and do some kind of innovative housing and family intervention work with families using that HUD funding stream. So there's a handful of kind of pre-selected waiver opportunities to use some of those traditional continuum of care housing funds in kind of new ways that would actually work better for young people, to help understand what are those different things that we would need to build out that array. That competition closes in November. One of the two things that I would highlight is that the child welfare system is a mandatory partner in that opportunity. So folks in this room who are hearing about this for the first time, folks in this room who are hearing about it for the first time, we can come talk to me about that later. The second thing is that we want youth voice in it as well, and that a mandatory partner is a youth advisory board to this opportunity. So we want to know that young people's voices are a big part of the opportunity that folks are applying for. So great. So I think that's going to be our last question. So do you guys want to close with some comments and take it away, or anything else you want to add? We've said a lot this afternoon or evening or morning.
Yeah, I would just encourage the child welfare agencies in the audience to think about, just to stop and reflect on maybe how housing matters, how housing might be able to help you achieve your outcomes, and to get in touch if you have questions about some of the research and some of the funding proposals that are coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, I would just add to essentially say that again, but basically, as an evaluator, a lot of the work I do in child welfare, we're always looking at a variety of different interventions. They come from different angles in terms of how to help youth, how to help families, whatever, and to start thinking of housing as an intervention would actually be a big change within the field.
So I think, Raphael, you want to join us for a moment and add a few things to this conversation?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for all of your work towards bridging the worlds of child welfare and housing. As we all know, the work sometimes seems so basic to get us in the room together, but it's not always the way we behave. And so what you've seen today is the beginning of a new era of child welfare and housing workers talking about the work differently and investing in the work in a very different way. And I want to lift up a couple of things that our panelists spoke of today that ties to the continued commitment of the Obama administration around taking bold action around trying to address and ultimately end youth and family homelessness by 2020. In this last year of the administration, Secretary Burwell, the Secretary from the Health and Human Services Department, in partnership with a variety of cabinet secretaries, Secretary Castro, Secretary King from Education, et cetera, are all working to try to pivot in this last year of the administration to laying the groundwork to ending youth and family homelessness. We heard from Sarah about the leadership of HUD in doing this work, and Health and Human Services has also done a tremendous amount in partnership with the Housing and Urban Development Department and Education to reimagine what it would take to ultimately end youth and family homelessness in our country. And I want to lift up a couple of ideas that have been touched upon briefly, but sort of are an example again of trying to test out new ideas much more boldly and with urgency. We announced recently a fantastic partnership with HUD and a variety of philanthropic foundations, including Casey Family Programs, the Melville Charitable Trust, and the Rakes Foundation, including Away Home America, and Rapid Results Institute, to launch a 100-day challenge in 3 cities across the country. So the city of Austin, the city of Cleveland, and the city of Los Angeles are boldly going to try to, in 100 days, imagine what it would be like if they had no barriers to ending youth homelessness in those cities. Why that matters is that for humans, we love competition. And sometimes it's simply creating the act of urgency to remove the imagined and sometimes intentionally constructed barriers to share information and to solve problems across our agencies, across our institutions, and amongst our cities. And we hope that just like the Rapid Results Institute work that happened around vets homelessness, that the cities that are going to take this up, launching on the ground in September, just in a few weeks, will give us all inspiration and hope around how we can, in fact, build bridges between child welfare and housing. And let us ground ourselves before we give one last announcement of what's going to happen next in this issue with related to the data that was surfaced in the first ever report by the Family Youth Services Bureau of the Health and Human Services Agency, trying to look at what happens to our young people with whom we come into contact in our street outreach program across the country. We worked with just under 1,000 young people in 11 cities across the country, and the data that was lifted up from those interactions is devastating, however you cut it, however you slice it, in all the cities. Bottom line, most young people who we talked with who were living on the streets, not in shelter, spent roughly 2 years living on the streets. More than 60% of those young people were raped, beaten up, robbed, or assaulted. Of the young people with whom we interacted, 30% self-identified as gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and 7% identified as transgender. And finally, about half of those youth across those 11 cities with whom we came into contact had had some history and been in foster care. And when you compared those young people who had had a foster care history with their counterpart youth who had not, they would be homeless and on the streets longer. No one is arguing here on this panel, nor are we arguing that that is conclusive evidence that foster care leads to homelessness. But let us not be fooled, which is that the foster care system and child welfare writ large and its relationship to homelessness and housing stability for youth, for families, for children has to be thought of and reimagined in a deeply different way. So taking up the very same message we encouraged you to think about this morning, What might you do when you leave this master session virtually or live in person to connect with someone not in your field working on these issues? How might you do something differently to build those bridges, or empowering yourself to call to the table these kinds of advocates and policymakers and folks who actually can make an enormous difference? For those of you interested in continuing this conversation, not just on the items that we lifted up today, but in practical terms, there's going to be a lunch session that is co-hosted by the Housing and Urban Development Department, as well as the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families in the Latrobe Room here. We invite you to join that conversation so that we can hear from you specifically about how child welfare might more effectively and might much more urgently address family and youth homelessness with deeper partnerships with our HUD counterparts and our housing advocates and those that are running housing systems across the country. We can learn from them, they can learn from us, but it starts by actually doing it. So please join us for that lunch conversation, informal, so that we can ultimately meet our goal and end youth and family homelessness in America by 2020. So thank you to our panelists for all you have done. Thank you for all of you who have joined us virtually or in person, and have a good afternoon and a good lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you. So much. Thank you. Thank you. Can I get one shot of the four of you so I can tweet that out real quick?